In the austere chambers of the San Francisco Superior Court, 12-year-old Emily Richardson stands before Judge Malcolm Bennett, her small frame nearly lost in the vastness of the courtroom. The judge peers down with unconcealed disdain at this child who dares to challenge his authority in a case that could determine the fate of dozens of homeless veterans. What happens next will shake the very foundations of the city's legal system. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun streams through the towering windows of courtroom 401, casting long shadows across the polished oak floors. Emily Richardson adjusts her navy blue dress, carefully pressed by her grandmother the night before. Her honey blonde hair is tied back in a neat ponytail, and despite her youth, her green eyes hold a determination that catches many observers off guard. Judge Malcolm Bennett shuffles through his papers, his silver-rimmed glasses reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights. His reputation for swift, often harsh decisions in civil cases is well known throughout the Bay Area legal community. The gallery behind Emily is packed with spectators, many of them veterans who've heard about this unusual hearing through the local VA network. "Young lady!" Judge Bennett's voice carries a weight of condescension that makes several attorneys in the gallery wince. "This is not your middle school debate club. We're discussing a multi-million-dollar property dispute that affects municipal zoning laws. What makes you think you have any standing to address this court?" Emily's voice remains steady, betraying none of the anxiety churning in her stomach. "Your Honor, under California Civil Code Section 372 and the precedent established in Williams v. Superior Court, I'm here as a representative of my grandfather, Master Sergeant James Richardson, and by extension, the 43 veterans currently residing at Valor House." Assistant District Attorney Sarah Martinez shifts uncomfortably in her chair. Something about this case has felt wrong from the start. The eviction notices, the sudden zoning changes, the rushed paperwork. But City Attorney Davidson had been adamant about fast-tracking the proceedings. "Miss Richardson," Judge Bennett's tone drips with sarcasm, "how exactly did you become such an expert in civil procedure? Perhaps from watching television courtroom dramas?" A ripple of nervous laughter moves through the courtroom, but Emily remains composed. Her right hand rests on a stack of meticulously organized documents, each tab color-coded and labeled with precision that would impress a seasoned lawyer. "Your Honor, I'm here because 6 months ago, my grandfather and 42 other veterans were promised permanent housing in a building that the city now claims was never properly zoned for residential use. The timing of this sudden discovery, coincidentally just after Golden Gate Development expressed interest in the property, deserves scrutiny." The judge's expression darkens. "Mind your tone, young lady. You're treading dangerously close to contempt." In the back of the courtroom, a man in an expensive charcoal suit slides his phone from his pocket, typing quickly, "We have a situation. The Richardson kid knows more than she should." The response comes moments later. "Handle it. The development plans can't be delayed." Emily's mind drifts to 3 months earlier when she first discovered her grandfather crying in his small room at Valor House. She'd never seen him cry before, not through 2 tours in Afghanistan, not through her grandmother's funeral, not even through his own battle with PTSD. But the eviction notice had broken something in him. That night, she'd started researching, first at the public library, then at the law library, where a kindly clerk, moved by her determination, had shown her how to access legal databases. Night after night she'd studied while her grandfather slept, preparing for this moment. "Your Honor," Emily continues, her voice gaining strength, I'd like to present evidence that the zoning changes affecting Valor House follow a pattern of suspicious modifications targeting veteran housing projects across 3 counties. Judge Bennett waves his hand dismissively. Miss Richardson, this court doesn't have time for conspiracy theories concocted by a child. Not theories, Your Honor. Facts. Emily opens her first folder, revealing documents that make Assistant de Martinez sit up straighter. I have here the original permit applications, showing that Valor House was properly zoned for residential use. The supposed clerical error cited by the city only emerged after Golden Gate Development submitted their preliminary bid. In the gallery, Emily's grandfather, James Richardson, watches with a mixture of pride and concern. His weathered hands grip his cane tightly, his military bearing still evident despite his elderly frame. Around him, other veterans lean forward, hope beginning to replace resignation in their eyes. What no one in the courtroom yet realizes is that Emily Richardson isn't just fighting for her grandfather's home. She's about to unravel a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of city government, exposing a pattern of corruption that has systematically displaced veterans across the state. And it all begins with a single property deed that someone thought no one would bother to verify. As Emily prepares to present her first piece of evidence, Judge Bennett has no idea that his perfectly ordered courtroom is about to become ground zero for a case that will make headlines across the country. The story of how a 12-year-old girl brought a powerful development company to its knees and saved not just her grandfather, but dozens of forgotten heroes is about to begin. 3 months earlier, the San Francisco Public Library had become Emily Richardson's second home. Tucked away in a quiet corner of the reference section, she'd spread out her grandfather's eviction notice alongside stacks of property law books. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Chen, watched with growing curiosity as this determined 12-year-old returned day after day, meticulously taking notes and requesting increasingly specific legal texts. "You know, Mrs." Chen had said one evening, placing a cup of hot chocolate beside Emily's notebooks, "My husband was a veteran too, Vietnam. When he came home, nobody wanted to talk about what the returning soldiers needed." She'd paused, studying the wall of documents Emily had assembled. "The law library at the courthouse has better resources for what you're researching." That suggestion had changed everything. At the courthouse law library, Emily had met retired paralegal Tony Martinez, whose daughter Sarah now worked as an assistant district attorney. Moved by Emily's determination to save her grandfather's home, Tony had begun teaching her how to navigate legal databases and understand property law. The trick, Tony had explained, showing her how to cross-reference property records, is that everything leaves a paper trail. You just have to know where to look. His eyes had narrowed when Emily showed him the eviction notice. "This timing isn't right. Golden Gate Development couldn't have filed these papers before the zoning change was official, but look at the dates." Emily's research had soon revealed a pattern that made her blood run cold. Valor House wasn't the first veterans' residence threatened by sudden zoning discoveries. Over the past 5 years, similar situations had played out across 3 counties. Each time, a property housing veterans would be found to have paperwork irregularities shortly after a major development company expressed interest. In her bedroom at night, Emily had created a timeline on her wall, hidden behind a poster of the Golden Gate Bridge. Red strings connected newspaper clippings, property records, and court decisions. The pattern was clear, but she needed proof that would stand up in court. Her grandfather, James Richardson, had noticed the changes in his granddaughter. The late nights, the intense focus, the legal papers hidden in her backpack. One evening he'd found her asleep at her desk, her face pressed against a law book. "Emmy," he'd said softly, using his old nickname for her, "you don't have to fix this. Sometimes the big guys win." His voice had cracked slightly. "I've lost homes before." Emily had looked up at him, her green eyes fierce. "Not this time, Grandpa. Did you know that when they closed the veterans' home in Oakland last year, the paperwork showed the same clerical error they're claiming here? The same lawyer filed the motions. The same development company bought the property." Her grandfather had stared at the wall of evidence she'd uncovered. "Good Lord, child, what have you found?" "They're targeting veterans' homes, Grandpa, all across the Bay Area. They wait until the residents are settled, then suddenly discover zoning problems. The veterans get evicted, the properties get rezoned for commercial use, and luxury condos go up. It's happened 6 times in 3 years. That night, Emily had made a decision. She couldn't just fight for Valor House. She had to expose the entire system. Her grandfather and his friends hadn't fought for their country only to be thrown out on the street by paper-pushing bureaucrats and greedy developers. Working with Tony Martinez, she'd learned how to file legal motions and request public records. She discovered that Golden Gate Development had created a web of shell companies to hide their property acquisitions. Each veteran's home they targeted followed the same pattern: sudden zoning issues, quick evictions, rapid development. But they'd made one crucial mistake. In their haste to process the Valor House evictions, they'd filed certain papers out of sequence. Emily had found the smoking gun buried in the county records. Golden Gate Development had begun construction permit applications before the zoning change was even proposed. "This is bigger than just one building," Tony had warned her. "These people have connections in City Hall, in the courts. Are you sure you want to take this on?" Emily had thought about her grandfather's face when he'd received the eviction notice, about the other veterans at Valor House, men and women who'd served their country only to face homelessness in their golden years. "They're counting on nobody caring enough to fight back," she'd replied. "They're counting on everyone being too scared or too busy to look closely at what they're doing." Now standing in Judge Bennett's courtroom, Emily was ready. The evidence was organized in her color-coded folders. The pattern of corruption was documented and cross-referenced. What no one in the courtroom realized was that this wasn't just about saving one veteran's home. It was about exposing a systematic campaign to exploit those who'd served their country. As she prepared to present her first piece of evidence, Emily caught her grandfather's eye in the gallery. He gave her a slight nod, his military bearing as straight as ever. Around him sat dozens of other veterans from Valor House, each one a story of service and sacrifice. Emily squared her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for a building, she was fighting for heroes. The sun had moved higher in the courtroom windows as Emily opened her first folder. Judge Bennett was about to learn that underestimating this 12-year-old girl would be the biggest mistake of his career. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emily removed the first document from her blue folder, her hands steady despite the tension in the courtroom. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence Exhibit A, the original zoning permit for Valor House, dated June 15th, 2020. She approached the bench with measured steps, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes following her movement. Judge Bennett accepted the document with poorly concealed impatience. "Miss Richardson, this has already been addressed. The city's records clearly show—" "If you'll look at page 3, Your Honor," Emily interrupted politely but firmly, "you'll see the official seal of the City Planning Commission, along with signatures from all 7 commissioners. This isn't a copy. It's the original document, which supposedly was lost when the current zoning dispute began." Assistant DA Sarah Martinez leaned forward, her interest piqued. She'd never seen this document in the case files provided by the city attorney's office. "Your Honor, may I approach to examine the document?" As Martinez studied the permit, Emily continued. Now I'd like to enter Exhibit B, construction permit applications filed by Golden Gate Development through their subsidiary Coastal Properties LLC, dated 2 months before they publicly expressed interest in the Valor House property. She pulled out another document, this one in a red folder. Note the timestamp on the digital submission. March 3rd, 2023, 3 weeks before the city discovered the alleged zoning irregularities. In the back of the courtroom, the man in the charcoal suit made another urgent phone call. The kid has the original permits. No, I don't know how. Yes, she has the construction applications too. His face paled as he listened to the response. Understood. I'll handle Martinez. Judge Bennett's expression had shifted from dismissive to concerned as he examined the documents. The dates didn't align with the city's official narrative, and the signatures were unmistakably authentic. Miss Richardson, how did you obtain these documents? Through proper channels, Your Honor. Public records requests, specifically California Government Code Section 6250, the Public Records Act. Emily's voice remained steady. I'd also like to draw the court's attention to something interesting about the signatures on the construction permits. She pulled out a third document, this one showing enlarged copies of several signatures. The notary stamp on Golden Gate Development's application belongs to Michael Chen, who served as a notary for all 6 previous veterans' housing properties that faced similar zoning issues in the past 3 years. Curiously, Mr. Chen also serves as the personal notary for Judge Harrison Wells, who presided over 4 of those eviction cases. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Wells was one of the most respected property court judges in Northern California. The implication of impropriety was bold, especially coming from a 12-year-old. Assistant DA Martinez studied Emily with growing admiration and concern. This wasn't just some kid playing lawyer. This was a methodically constructed case that hinted at deep-rooted corruption. She made a mental note to review her own case files more carefully. In the gallery, James Richardson watched his granddaughter with a mixture of pride and fear. He recognized the look in her eyes, the same determination he'd seen in his fellow soldiers when they knew they were right, but faced overwhelming odds. Around him, other veterans from Valor House sat straighter in their seats, hope beginning to replace resignation in their weathered faces. Furthermore, Emily continued, pulling out yet another document. I have here bank records showing transfers from Coastal Properties LLC to privately held accounts in the Cayman Islands. These transfers occurred within 48 hours of each veteran's housing eviction case, ruling over the past 3 years. Judge Bennett's face had lost its condescending expression entirely. Miss Richardson, these are serious allegations. Do you understand the implications of what you're presenting? Yes, Your Honor, I do. Emily's voice carried a gravity beyond her years. I understand that powerful people have been systematically targeting vulnerable veterans, using fraudulent paperwork and suspicious court rulings to steal their homes. I understand that millions of dollars have changed hands while decorated service members were thrown into the streets. And I understand that no one expected a 12-year-old girl to notice, much less prove it. The man in the charcoal suit had stopped making phone calls. His attention was now fully focused on Assistant DA Martinez, watching her reactions to each new piece of evidence. A note was discreetly passed to her. Remember who you work for. This needs to end now. But Martinez was already connecting dots she'd previously ignored. The rushed paperwork, the pressure to expedite evictions, the coincidental timing of development applications. It all pointed to a coordinated scheme that went far beyond simple zoning disputes. Your Honor, Emily said, reaching for her green folder, I haven't even shown you the most compelling evidence yet. Would you like to see the email exchanges between Golden Gate development executives and certain city officials discussing how to handle the veteran problem in developing neighborhoods? Judge Bennett's gavel came down sharply. We'll take a 15-minute recess. His voice had lost its earlier condescension, replaced by something that sounded almost like concern. Miss Richardson, I'd advise you to be very certain about your next allegations. As the courtroom began to clear, Emily caught snippets of whispered conversations around her. The veterans in the gallery were talking animatedly among themselves, sharing stories of other suspicious evictions they'd heard about. Legal observers were furiously taking notes, and several journalists had slipped into the back row. What no one noticed was the quiet exchange between the man in the charcoal suit and someone on his phone. The girl has everything, not just Valor House, everything. Get me Davidson from the city attorney's office. Now. Emily used the recess to organize her next set of documents, unaware that her evidence was about to trigger a chain reaction that would shake San Francisco's power structure to its core. The real battle was just beginning. During the recess, the courthouse corridors buzzed with activity. City Attorney William Davidson had arrived, his expensive suit and commanding presence drawing attention as he strode toward Judge Bennett's chambers. Behind him walked Marcus Fuller, General Counsel for Golden Gate Development, his typically composed demeanor showing signs of strain. Emily sat alone at a wooden bench outside the courtroom, reviewing her notes. The green folder containing the email exchanges sat sealed beside her. What the opposition didn't know was that these weren't her only copies. Tony Martinez had helped her create multiple backups, stored in secure locations. Miss Richardson. The voice was smooth, professional. Emily looked up to see a woman in a tailored business suit. I'm Patricia Reynolds, Counsel for Golden Gate Development. Could we speak privately for a moment? Before Emily could respond, her grandfather appeared, his military bearing impressive despite his age. My granddaughter doesn't speak to anyone without me present, ma'am. Reynolds smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Of course, I simply wanted to discuss a potential resolution that could benefit everyone. Golden Gate Development is prepared to offer very generous relocation packages to all Valor House residents. Private accommodations, moving expenses covered, even a stipend for inconvenience. You mean hush money, Emily said quietly, meeting Reynolds's gaze. Like you offered the veterans at the Oakland facility before they mysteriously dropped their lawsuit last year. Reynolds's smile flickered. I'm not familiar with that situation. I'm simply trying to help find an amicable solution. The solution is simple, James Richardson interjected. Leave our home alone. These men and women served their country. They shouldn't have to serve your profit margins, too. Inside Judge Bennett's chambers, a different conversation was taking place. City Attorney Davidson was presenting an urgent motion to dismiss, citing jurisdictional issues and challenging Emily's standing to present evidence. Your Honor, Davidson argued, setting aside the obvious irregularity of allowing a minor to present a case of this magnitude, these allegations could seriously damage public confidence in city institutions. The proper venue for investigating such claims is through official channels. Judge Bennett removed his glasses, rubbing his temples. The proper venue, Mr. Davidson, is wherever the truth can be found. Miss Richardson's evidence regarding the permit dates is troubling, to say the least. Evidence that was likely obtained through improper means, Fuller interjected. We're prepared to file criminal complaints regarding unauthorized access to confidential business records. In the corridor, Assistant DA Sarah Martinez watched the interaction between Emily and Reynolds with growing concern. Something about this case had bothered her from the start, but now she was beginning to understand why. She pulled out her phone, dialing a number she rarely used. Dad, those files you helped Emily find, how many copies did you make? Tony Martinez's voice was calm. Enough. Sarah, be careful. This goes deeper than you know. Check the Clayton Street development project from last year. Same players, same patterns. Meanwhile, Emily noticed a courthouse janitor approaching her bench, pushing his cleaning cart. As he passed, he discreetly dropped a folded note beside her. Opening it, she read, "They're trying to seal the case. Motion being filed now. T. Obey." Emily's mind raced. She had prepared for this possibility, but she hadn't expected it so soon. She quickly opened her laptop, connecting to the courthouse's public Wi-Fi. A few keystrokes later, an email was sent to every major news outlet in San Francisco, containing just enough of her evidence to make the story impossible to ignore. Back in chambers, Fuller's phone buzzed. His face drained of color as he read the message. "The press has it. Channel 7 is already running a teaser about systematic veteran housing fraud." Judge Bennett's expression hardened. "Mr. Davidson, Mr. Fuller, I'm beginning to think Miss Richardson's evidence deserves a full hearing, unless you have a compelling reason why it shouldn't be presented in open court." Before either man could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Reporters had begun arriving, drawn by the explosive allegations in Emily's email. Camera crews set up outside the courthouse as veterans from Valor House began sharing their stories. Emily watched through the courthouse window as the media circus grew. This had been part of her strategy. Once the story was public, it would be harder for them to bury it. She opened her red folder, reviewing the next set of documents she planned to present. "Emmy," her grandfather said softly, "are you sure about this? These are powerful people you're taking on." Emily nodded, her expression determined. "They counted on everyone being too afraid to fight back, Grandpa. They counted on being able to bully and threaten their way through this. But they didn't count on one thing." "What's that, sweetheart?" "They didn't count on someone who had nothing to lose and everything to gain by telling the truth. They didn't count on someone too young to be scared of them." As the recess neared its end, Emily noticed Assistant DA Martinez approaching her, a thick file under her arm. "Miss Richardson, I think there's something you should see. I pulled the records from the Clayton Street development project. The pattern matches exactly what you've uncovered." The pieces were falling into place faster now, but in Judge Bennett's chambers, the opposition was preparing their own counter-move. "If this evidence is presented," Fuller warned, "certain parties will have no choice but to protect their interests, by any means necessary." The threat hung in the air as the bailiff announced the court's return to session. Emily gathered her of folders, squaring her shoulders. The next phase of the battle was about to begin, and she was ready for whatever they threw at her. What no one in the courtroom realized was that Emily's next piece of evidence would do more than expose a real estate scandal. It would reveal a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of city government, involving judges, officials, and business leaders who had been profiting from veteran displacement for years. The afternoon session was about to begin, and San Francisco's power structure was about to face its greatest challenge from the most unlikely source imaginable. A 12-year-old girl with a stack of folders and an unshakable determination to see justice done. The afternoon session began with an electric tension in the air. Journalists had filled the back rows of the courtroom, their presence adding to the nervous energy. Judge Bennett had denied the motion to seal the proceedings, much to City Attorney Davidson's visible frustration. Emily stood at the podium, her green folder open before her. "Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that demonstrates this isn't just about Valor House. What we're seeing is a systematic campaign to exploit vulnerable veterans across Northern California." She removed a series of documents, each one color-coded and carefully annotated. "These are email exchanges between Golden Gate development executives and various city officials spanning the last 3 years. I'd like to direct the court's attention to an email dated March 15, 2022, from Vice President Thomas Wheeler to City Planning Commissioner James Morris. The email appeared on the courtroom's evidence display screen. Emily's voice was clear and steady as she read, "The veteran situation needs to be handled delicately. These properties are gold mines once we clear out the current residents. Harrison says he can fast-track the zoning changes through his department, but we need to manage the PR angle. Nobody wants to be seen evicting war heroes." A murmur ran through the courtroom. In the gallery, veterans from Valor House exchanged knowing looks. They'd seen this pattern before, but never had the proof. Following this email, Emily continued, there were 17 separate communications between Golden Gate Development and city officials discussing what they called Operation Relocation. Note the language used: minimal resistance expected, media management strategies, and judicial cooperation assured. City Attorney Davidson stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. These documents were obtained illegally through proper public records requests," Emily interrupted, producing a stack of receipt-stamped request forms. "Every document here was obtained legally. The fact that no one expected a 12-year-old to file these requests doesn't make them invalid." In the back of the courtroom, Marcus Fuller was rapidly typing on his phone. "Wheeler's emails are exposed. Full damage control needed. Contact Harrison immediately." Emily pulled out another document. This spreadsheet, created by Golden Gate Development's financial department, shows projected profits from each converted veteran's property. Notice the column labeled Judicial Incentives. Over the past 3 years, more than $2.3 million has been paid out to various officials through offshore accounts. Assistant DA Martinez studied the numbers, her legal training spotting the careful way the payments had been disguised. Cases she'd prosecuted over the past year suddenly appeared in a new light. How many times had she been used as an unwitting part of this scheme? "Your Honor," Emily said, her voice taking on a more personal tone, "my grandfather and his friends at Valor House aren't just statistics in a spreadsheet. They're men and women who put their lives on the line for this country. Master Sergeant James Richardson served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Sergeant Maria Hernandez, who lives on the 3rd floor, earned a Bronze Star in Iraq. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Chen, 2nd floor, led rescue operations during Hurricane Katrina." She gestured to the veterans filling the gallery. "These are American heroes, and this document shows how much money Golden Gate Development expected to make by throwing them out on the street. $147 million in projected profits from luxury condos built on land that was promised to veterans." Judge Bennett leaned forward, his earlier skepticism completely gone. "Miss Richardson, these allegations go far beyond a simple zoning dispute. You're describing a criminal conspiracy." "Yes, Your Honor, and it gets worse." Emily pulled out what appeared to be architectural plans. "These are the original designs for Valor House, submitted to the city in 2020. Notice the signature of the lead architect, Michael Harrison. Now, look at this." She produced another document. "This is Michael Harrison's death certificate from 2019. Someone forged his signature on these plans a year after he died." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Emily continued, her voice cutting through the noise. "The fake signature appears on documents for all 6 veterans' properties that were seized and developed. Always the same signature. Always by a man who was already dead. They didn't even bother to use different forgeries." In the gallery, James Richardson watched his granddaughter with a mixture of pride and concern. He recognized the stakes now. This wasn't just about saving their home anymore. Emily had uncovered something much bigger, much more dangerous. "Furthermore," Emily said, reaching for her blue folder, I have here bank statements showing transfers from Golden Gate Development subsidiary companies to private accounts held by—" "That's enough." The shout came from the back of the courtroom. Thomas Wheeler himself had arrived, his face red with anger. "Your Honor, I demand these proceedings be stopped immediately. This is nothing but a malicious attempt to—" "To what, Mr. Wheeler?" Emily asked calmly. "To expose how you've been profiting from veterans' misery, to show how you've been bribing officials and forging documents, or to reveal the offshore accounts where you've been hiding the money?" Wheeler's face went from red to white. In the gallery, journalists were frantically taking notes, and several news cameras had somehow found their way into the courtroom despite the usual restrictions. Judge Bennett's gavel came down hard. "Mr. Wheeler, unless you are here as a properly represented party to these proceedings, I suggest you sit down." "Miss Richardson, please continue." Emily nodded, but before she could speak, Assistant DA Martinez stood. "Your Honor, given the evidence presented, the District Attorney's Office would like to request an immediate investigation into these allegations. I'm prepared to contact the FBI's Public Corruption Division." Wheeler stormed out of the courtroom, nearly colliding with two serious-looking men in dark suits who were just entering. They showed their badges to the bailiff, FBI agents, already responding to the evidence Emily had sent to their public corruption tip line 3 days earlier. The pieces were falling into place faster than anyone had anticipated. Emily's next piece of evidence would do more than just save Valor House. It would tear down an entire network of corruption that had been preying on veterans for years. As she opened her next folder, Emily caught her grandfather's eye. He gave her a slight nod, the same nod he'd given his soldiers before a crucial mission. The real battle was just beginning. The next hour unfolded like a high-stakes chess match. As Emily prepared to reveal her next piece of evidence, the courthouse erupted into carefully orchestrated chaos. Fire alarms suddenly blared throughout. The building and security guards began evacuating the courtroom. "Your Honor," Emily said quickly, recognizing the tactical delay for what it was, "I request all evidence currently presented remain in the court's direct custody." Her months of research hadn't just taught her about property law. She'd studied every trick used to dismiss controversial cases. Judge Bennett nodded, instructing the bailiff to secure all documents. In the gallery, James Richardson noticed 2 men trying to slip through the crowd toward the evidence table. He caught the eye of Lieutenant Colonel Chen, and without a word, several veterans casually repositioned themselves, forming an impromptu barrier. Outside the courthouse, Emily huddled with Assistant DA Martinez and Tony Martinez. "They're desperate," Tony observed, watching suited figures hurrying in and out of the building. The fire alarm was too convenient. Sarah Martinez agreed, her prosecutor's instincts on high alert. "They'll try to use the evacuation to reorganize. Emily, what else do you have in those folders?" Emily's voice was low but steady. "The offshore accounts are just the start. I found connections between Golden Gate Development and 3 other companies that have been targeting veteran housing projects up and down the West Coast. They're all shell corporations, leading back to someone called the Director." Tony's face paled. "The Director, are you sure?" Before he could elaborate, Patricia Reynolds approached their group, her professional demeanor slightly frayed. "Miss Richardson, given these unfortunate delays, perhaps now would be a good time to reconsider our earlier offer. We are prepared to be very generous." Emily met her gaze. "Like you were generous with the veterans in Portland last year, before their building mysteriously burned down and they lost everything, including their military service records?" Reynolds's composure cracked slightly. "I don't know what you're implying." "I have the insurance investigator's preliminary report," Emily cut in. The one that was buried after Golden Gate's subsidiary bought the investigation company, just like I have the real estate records showing. How your shell companies acquired 5 other veteran properties after suspicious accidents or emergencies. In the background, fire trucks arrived, their sirens adding to the chaos. But Emily noticed something odd. The firefighters weren't rushing into the building. Instead, they were having an intense discussion with a man she recognized from Golden Gate Development's board photos. James Richardson wheeled around suddenly, his military training spotting something others had missed. "Emmy, your laptop bag." Emily turned to see a man in a maintenance uniform trying to slip away with her bag, Lieutenant Colonel Chen's cane. Shot out, catching the would-be thief's ankle. As he stumbled, 2 FBI agents smoothly intercepted him. "That's fine," Emily said calmly, watching the man being led away. "Everything important is backed up. Tony helped me create copies of all the evidence, stored in secure locations. If anything happens to me or my grandfather, it all goes public automatically." Sarah Martinez's phone buzzed with a message from her office. Her expression hardened as she read it. "They're trying to get an emergency injunction from Judge Harrison Wells to stop the proceedings." Judge Wells, Emily's smile was knowing. The same Judge Wells whose signature appears on Golden Gate Development's offshore account documents. The one who received monthly payments through a shell company called Veteran Transition Services LLC. Riddle's phone rang. After a brief conversation, her face showed real fear for the first time. "Mr. Wheeler would like to speak with you privately, Miss Richardson. He's prepared to make this worth your while." "Everything's already worth my while," Emily replied. "Every veteran who gets to keep their home, every family that doesn't get torn apart by your schemes, that's what matters." The fire department finally gave the all-clear, allowing people back into the courthouse. As they filed in, Emily noticed several new faces in expensive suits, huddled with City Attorney Davidson. The opposition was calling in reinforcements. Inside the courtroom, Judge Bennett had used the delay to review more of Emily's evidence. His face was grim as he studied the documents about the Portland incident. 23 veterans had lost everything in that fire, and the insurance settlement had been suspiciously low. "Your Honor," Davidson began as soon as everyone was seated, "given the complex nature of these allegations, we move for an immediate stay, pending review by a higher court." "Which higher court?" Emily asked innocently. "The Ninth Circuit, where Judge Matthews presides. The same Judge Matthews whose wife serves on Golden Gate Development's board through a proxy corporation." She pulled out another document. "Or perhaps the State Supreme Court, where Justice Phillips has been receiving consulting fees from your subsidiary companies." The courtroom fell silent. Emily opened her yellow folder, removing a single sheet of paper. "Before Mr. Davidson continues, I think everyone should see this email chain between Golden Gate executives, discussing which judges they owned and how to route cases to friendly courts." In the gallery, journalists were practically salivating. This wasn't just a story about one building anymore. It was possibly the biggest corruption scandal in San Francisco's history. The FBI agents had moved closer to the front of the courtroom, their presence a clear message to anyone thinking of interfering further. One of them spoke quietly into his phone, requesting additional resources. Emily's grandfather watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety as his granddaughter prepared to reveal the next piece of evidence. He'd led men into battle, faced enemy fire, but he'd never seen courage quite like this. A 12-year-old girl standing alone against a system of corruption that had seemed untouchable. As Emily opened her next folder, she knew the real fight was just beginning. The opposition was cornered, and cornered predators are the most dangerous. But she had one advantage they didn't expect. She'd prepared for everything, even their desperate counter-moves. The afternoon sun slanted through the courthouse windows as Emily stood to continue her presentation. The next revelation would shake San Francisco's power structure to its core, and no amount of fire alarms or stolen laptops could stop the truth from coming out. As Emily rose to continue her presentation, a subtle shift occurred in the courtroom. The veterans in the gallery leaned forward, their military training sensing the tension in the air. Two more FBI agents quietly entered, positioning themselves near the exits. Assistant DA Martinez noticed private security contractors from Golden Gate Development doing the same. "Your Honor," Emily began, her voice clear and steady, "what I'm about to present goes beyond real estate fraud. This evidence shows a coordinated effort to systematically target veterans' facilities across 5 states." She removed a thick document from her yellow folder, its pages carefully tabbed and highlighted. "This is an internal memo from Golden Gate Development's Strategic Planning Department, dated January 2021. It outlines what they called Operation Homecoming, a 5-year plan to acquire properties specifically designated for veteran housing. Judge Bennett accepted the document, his expression darkening as he read, "Miss Richardson, these allegations extend beyond this court's jurisdiction." "Yes, Your Honor. That's why I've already provided copies to federal authorities and state prosecutors in Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and Arizona." Emily's preparation had been thorough. The pattern is identical in each state. First, they identify veteran housing facilities in rapidly gentrifying areas. Then, through a network of shell companies, they create artificial zoning issues or building code violations. In the back of the courtroom, Thomas Wheeler was engaged in an intense whispered conversation with his lawyers. One of them repeatedly shook his head, looking increasingly concerned. Wheeler's face had turned an alarming shade of red. Emily continued, pulling up a complex diagram on the courtroom's display screen. "This chart shows the relationships between seemingly independent development companies across the western United States. All of them lead back to a holding company called Patriot Property Management." She paused, letting the irony of the name sink in. A company that, coincidentally, was incorporated the day after the Veterans Housing Initiative Act passed Congress. City Attorney Davidson stood, his voice strained. "Your Honor, I must object to this line of—" "Let me save you some time, Mr. Davidson," Emily interrupted politely. "Before you claim these documents were obtained improperly, you should know that every piece of evidence came from public records or through legal discovery requests. The fact that nobody noticed these connections before doesn't make them inadmissible." She pulled out another document, this one bearing official federal letterhead. "This is a report from the VA's Office of Inspector General, documenting the suspicious pattern of veteran housing closures. It was buried under administrative reviews until a kind clerk helped me locate it through a Freedom of Information Act request." In the gallery, James Richardson noticed a subtle movement. A man in an expensive suit was photographing everyone in the courtroom with a small camera disguised as a phone. Lieutenant Colonel Chen nodded slightly. He'd seen it too. The veterans began quietly documenting the surveillance, using their own phones. "The report," Emily continued, "shows that in the past 3 years, 37 veteran housing facilities across 5 states have been closed due to sudden administrative issues. In 35 of those cases, the properties were acquired by subsidiaries of companies linked to Patriot Property Management." She displayed another document on the screen. "This email chain between Thomas Wheeler and someone identified only as director discusses how to handle resistant residents. I quote, 'These old soldiers think their service means something. Show them what real power looks like.'" The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs. Veterans in the gallery sat straighter, their faces hard with controlled anger. The FBI agents shifted slightly, watching Wheeler and his associates more closely. "But here's what makes this particularly interesting," Emily said, her voice cutting through the noise. The metadata from these emails shows they were sent from an IP address registered to a very interesting location, the Office of Urban Development at City Hall. Assistant DA Martinez's phone buzzed with an urgent message. Her face remained professional, but her hand tightened on her pen. The message read, "Back off this case now. Remember your father's pension review next month." Emily wasn't finished. "I have here financial records showing that Patriot Property Management has paid out over $50 million in consulting fees to various shell companies over the past 3 years. Companies that, when traced through corporate registries, lead back to high-ranking city officials, judges, and—" She paused, looking directly at Wheeler. "Federal housing administrators." Wheeler stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. "This is absurd. Your Honor, I won't sit here and listen to these ridiculous—" "Sit down, Mr. Wheeler." Judge Bennett's voice cracked like a whip. "Miss Richardson, please continue." Emily nodded, pulling out what appeared to be architectural plans. "These are the original plans for Valor House, showing it was specifically designed to accommodate disabled veterans. Note the signature of the city's chief building inspector, certifying it met all codes." She placed another document beside it, and these are the modified plans, submitted just 2 months ago, showing the same building suddenly fails to meet basic safety requirements. The inspector's signature is identical, digitally copied from the original. In the gallery, Tony Martinez noticed something disturbing. The private security contractors were speaking into concealed microphones, and more suits were entering the courtroom. He quietly told his daughter, who signaled the FBI agents. Emily seemed unaware of the building tension as she continued. "But the most damaging evidence is this." She held up a final document. A complete record of every veteran housing facility targeted by this operation, including projected profits, officials to be bribed, and— She looked directly at Wheeler again. "Contingency plans for dealing with troublemakers who try to expose the scheme." The implications were clear. This wasn't just about real estate anymore. It was about systematic corruption and the willingness to silence anyone who got in the way. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as Emily prepared to reveal her next piece of evidence, one that would prove just how far the conspirators were willing to go to protect their scheme. The real battle was about to begin, and nobody in that courtroom could predict just how explosive the next revelation would be. Judge Bennett called for a 30-minute recess, but no one in the courthouse relaxed. FBI agents huddled in corners, speaking urgently into their phones. Journalists rushed to file updates, their fingers flying over laptops and phones. The story was exploding across social media, with hashtags like Valor House and the Veteran Justice trending nationally. Emily sat in a small conference room, surrounded by her grandfather and several veterans from Valor House. Lieutenant Colonel Chen stood guard at the door, his military bearing unchanged despite his age. Assistant DA Martinez and her father Tony had joined them, bringing troubling news. "They're making moves," Tony said quietly, showing Emily his tablet. "Emergency motions filed in 3 different courts. They're trying to get injunctions to stop you from presenting any more evidence." Sarah Martinez nodded grimly. "And it's not just legal pressure. I've received 3 calls from the DA's office telling me to distance myself from this case. They're threatening careers now." "Not just careers," James Richardson interjected, holding up his phone. "Emmy, look at this." The screen showed an email that had just arrived, candid photos of Emily walking to school, entering the library, visiting her grandmother's grave. The message was clear. They were watching. Emily's hand trembled slightly as she viewed the photos, but her voice remained steady. "They're scared. This is what they do when they're scared. They try to intimidate people into silence." Outside the conference room, the courthouse hallways buzzed with activity. Thomas Wheeler had set up an impromptu command center in a borrowed office, surrounded by lawyers and PR specialists trying to contain the damage. His face was ashen as he read updates from his phone. "Sir," one of his lawyers said urgently, "we have a bigger problem. The FBI just served warrants at our Seattle and Portland offices. They're seizing everything." Wheeler slammed his fist on the desk. How did a 12-year-old girl do this? How did she find connections that we spent millions hiding? In another part of the building, City Attorney Davidson was having an equally tense conversation with someone identified only as Director on his phone. "She has everything. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, even the Portland operation. No, I don't know how. Yes, I understand the implications." Back in the conference room, Emily spread out her remaining evidence folders. "They'll try to stop me from presenting the next part," she explained to her supporters. "That's why I need everyone to understand what to do if something happens." "Happens?" Her grandfather's voice was sharp with concern. "Emmy, what are you talking about?" Emily met his eyes steadily. "Grandpa, remember what you taught me about combat planning? Always have contingencies." She turned to Tony Martinez. "You have the backup drives?" Tony nodded. 3 copies, stored in secure locations, plus everything uploaded to encrypted cloud storage that will automatically release to media outlets if we don't enter the daily code. Sarah Martinez's phone buzzed again. The color drained from her face as she read the message. "They're bringing in Judge Harrison Wells to issue an emergency gag order. He's supposedly cutting his vacation short to hear their motion in an hour." "Judge Wells!" Emily's smile was grim. "Perfect timing." She pulled a document from her red folder. "Look at his financial records for the past 3 years. Every time Wells ruled on a case involving veteran housing, large deposits appeared in his wife's consulting company account exactly 3 days later." In the hallway, more FBI agents had arrived, along with representatives from the U.S. Attorney's office. The case had grown beyond a local property dispute into a major federal investigation. Journalists were broadcasting live from the courthouse steps, sharing details of the expanding scandal. Lieutenant Colonel Chen's phone vibrated. His expression remained neutral as he read the message, but his grip tightened on his cane. "Miss Emily, my contacts at the VA just confirmed something interesting. Remember those missing service records from the Portland fire? Copies were just discovered in a storage facility owned by Patriot Property Management." Emily nodded, unsurprised. "They're trying to destroy evidence, but they don't know about the digital copies I found in their own backup servers." She turned to Tony. "Remember that IT contractor you introduced me to, the one who used to work for Golden Gate Development? He helped me access their cloud storage before they could wipe it." James Richardson watched his granddaughter with a mixture of pride and fear. The quiet girl who used to spend hours reading in her room had become a force of justice, taking on powerful people who wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone who threatened their schemes. A knock at the door made everyone tense. An FBI agent entered, his expression serious. "Miss Richardson, we have credible information about a potential security threat. We'd like to assign protective detail to you and your grandfather." Before Emily could respond, Sarah Martinez's phone rang. Her face hardened as she listened. "They're making their move. Judge Wells is already in the building. They're trying to rush through the gag order before we can present the evidence about his involvement." Emily stood, gathering her folders. "Then we need to get back to court now. Everything we have on Wells needs to be presented before he can issue that order." She looked at her grandfather, seeing the worry in his eyes. "We knew they'd fight back, Grandpa, but they forgot something important." "What's that, Emmy?" "They forgot that sometimes the biggest courage comes in the smallest packages, and they forgot that veterans never leave anyone behind, including each other." As they prepared to return to the courtroom, Emily noticed more private security. Contractors positioning themselves throughout the building. The opposition was mobilizing every resource they had, but so were Emily's supporters. Veterans from other facilities had begun arriving, having heard about the case through their networks. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as Emily organized her next set of evidence. The opposition thought they were dealing with a child they could easily silence. They were about to learn that underestimating Emily Richardson was the biggest mistake they could make. The real battle was about to begin, and this time the whole world would be watching. The atmosphere in courtroom 401 crackled with tension as Judge Harrison Wells swept in, his black robes billowing behind him. His face bore the confident expression of the man accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. Emily noticed how he barely glanced at the FBI agents present, his demeanor suggesting complete immunity from concern. "Given the sensitive nature of these proceedings," Wells began, not bothering to hide his disdain, "I'm issuing an immediate gag order. All evidence presented here today will be sealed, and no parties are to discuss." "Objection, Your Honor." Emily's clear voice cut through the courtroom. She stood, clutching a purple folder she hadn't shown before. Under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 63, you cannot assume control of these proceedings without proper cause and documentation of Judge Bennett's incapacity. Wells's face flushed slightly. "Young lady, you are in no position to—" "Furthermore," Emily continued, her voice steady, "I move that you recuse yourself immediately, given your significant financial conflicts of interest in this case." She opened the purple folder, removing a stack of papers. "I have here banking records showing transfers from Patriot Property Management's shell companies to Mountain Vista Consulting LLC, a company registered to your wife, Barbara Wells." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Wells' face went from red to white. "Those records are sealed by court order." "Actually, Your Honor," Emily replied, "they're public records in Delaware where Mountain Vista is incorporated. Would you like to explain why your wife's consulting company received exactly $175,000, 3 days after each of your rulings favoring Golden Gate Development's property acquisitions?" Assistant DA Martinez stood. "Your Honor, given these allegations, the District Attorney's Office supports the motion for recusal." Wells banged his gavel. "This is outrageous. I will not be questioned by a child about—" "Then perhaps," Emily interrupted again, "you'd prefer to answer questions from the FBI about the offshore account in the Cayman Islands, the one that received matching deposits every time Mountain Vista Consulting was paid." 2 FBI agents moved closer to the bench. In the gallery, journalists were frantically taking notes, while the veterans sat with rigid attention, their faces showing growing anger at each new revelation of corruption. "I have here," Emily continued, pulling out more documents, "emails between Mountain Vista Consulting and Golden Gate Development, discussing what they called judicial service fees. The email addresses match your home IP address, Judge Wells. The same IP address used to access the offshore account." Wells started to rise, but Emily wasn't finished. "But the most interesting evidence is this." She held up a final document, a transcript of a phone call between you and Thomas Wheeler, recorded by Golden Gate Development's own security system, discussing how to handle troublesome veterans who wouldn't accept their eviction notices. The judge's face had gone completely ashen. In the back of the courtroom, Wheeler was frantically whispering to his lawyers, while City Attorney Davidson appeared to be having trouble breathing. "Your Honor," one of the FBI agents stepped forward, "we need to speak with you immediately regarding these allegations." Wells looked around wildly, suddenly realizing he was trapped. His carefully constructed world of power and influence was crumbling, brought down by a 12-year-old girl with a purple folder. "Before you leave with the FBI," Emily said, her voice now carrying an edge of controlled anger, I'd like to read. One more thing. She pulled out a single page. This is from your email to Mr. Wheeler last year, discussing the Portland veterans. These people served their country? Please, they're just obstacles to progress. Handle them however you need. Do. The veterans in the gallery stood as one, their faces hard with controlled fury. Lieutenant Colonel Chen's voice cut through the tension. Semper Fi, Your Honor. The words were respectful, but the tone made them sound like a threat. Judge Bennett, who had been watching silently, finally spoke. Judge Wells, I think it's best if you step down immediately. Bailiff, please ensure Judge Wells remains available to speak with the FBI agents. As Wells was led away, Emily turned to her next set of evidence. Your Honor, she addressed Judge Bennett, with the attempted interruption resolved, I'd like to continue presenting evidence about the broader conspiracy. What Judge Wells didn't know was that his participation was just one small part of a much larger operation. She opened her black folder, revealing documents that made even the FBI agents look surprised. This evidence shows that Operation Homecoming wasn't just about real estate. It was about systematically exploiting veterans for profit, using a network of corrupt judges, officials, and developers across multiple states. Wheeler stood suddenly. Your Honor, I request a recess to what, Mr. Wheeler? Emily asked. To delete more evidence? To threaten more witnesses? Or to move more money through your offshore accounts? She held up her phone, showing a real-time banking alert, like the transfers you're attempting to make right now to accounts in Singapore. The FBI agents moved quickly to surround Wheeler. In the gallery, James Richardson watched with pride as his granddaughter continued her methodical dismantling of a corruption network that had seemed untouchable just hours ago. What nobody realized was that Emily's next revelation would make the Judge Wells scandal look minor in comparison. She was about to expose something that would shake the very foundations of the justice system and change how America treated its veterans forever. The afternoon sun continued its arc across the courtroom windows, casting long shadows that seemed to symbolize the dark corruption Emily was bringing into the light. The real battle was far from over, but the tide had definitely turned. The aftermath of Judge Wells's exposure sent shockwaves through the San Francisco legal community. As FBI agents escorted the disgraced judge from the courthouse, Emily noticed a flurry of activity among the remaining officials. Phones buzzed continuously as news of Wells' corruption spread, causing panic among those who had participated in his schemes. Your Honor, Emily addressed Judge Bennett, her voice clear despite the chaos. What we just witnessed with Judge Wells represents only one strand of a much larger web. I'd like to present evidence showing how this corruption network systematically targeted veterans across the entire West Coast. She opened her black folder, revealing a complex organizational chart. This diagram shows the relationship between seemingly independent entities, judges, development companies, city officials, and what appeared to be veteran support organizations. But notice these recurring patterns. The courtroom display screen lit up with highlighted connections. Emily continued, every time a veteran's facility was targeted, a specific sequence of events occurred. First, a supposedly independent veterans advocacy group would appear, offering to help residents explore their options. She pulled out a stack of business cards. These organizations, Veterans Future Alliance, Heroes Housing Initiative, Service Member Transition Services, all trace back to shell companies controlled by Golden Gate Development. They weren't helping veterans, they were gathering intelligence on which properties would be easiest to seize. Assistant DA Martinez leaned forward, her prosecutor's instincts firing. Miss Richardson, are you suggesting these organizations were created specifically to exploit veterans? Not just exploit them, Ms. Martinez. They were created to manipulate them. Emily displayed a series of internal emails. Look at this communication from Thomas Wheeler to his regional directors. These old soldiers still respond to authority. Send in our people in uniform, make them think we're on their side. The veterans in the gallery shifted angrily. James Richardson's hands gripped his cane tightly, his knuckles white. Around him, other veterans from Valor House exchanged dark looks, recognizing tactics that had been used against them. But here's where it becomes truly sinister, Emily continued, pulling out another document. This is a psychological profile created by Golden Gate Development's consultants, specifically analyzing how to manipulate veterans suffering from PTSD and other service-related conditions. They deliberately targeted the most vulnerable residents first. Judge Bennett's face hardened as he reviewed the document. This is despicable. It gets worse, Your Honor. Emily displayed a new set of records. Once they identified vulnerable residents, they would create artificial crises. Bureaucratic problems, sudden regulation changes, even staged safety incidents, all designed to pressure veterans into accepting voluntary relocation. In the back of the courtroom, Thomas Wheeler's remaining lawyers were frantically making calls. One by one, their calls went unanswered as former allies distanced themselves from the growing scandal. Lieutenant Colonel Chen spoke up from the gallery, his voice carrying the weight of command. Miss Richardson, 3 months ago, we had a suspicious gas leak at Valor House. Are you saying? Yes, sir. Emily pulled out maintenance records. The gas leak was artificially created by a maintenance company owned by one of Golden Gate's shell corporations. They needed an excuse to evacuate the building for safety. Inspections that mysteriously always found serious code violations. FBI agents were taking rapid notes, while representatives from the U.S. Attorney's Office conferred in whispers. The case had grown far beyond a local property dispute into something that demanded federal intervention. Your Honor, Emily said, her voice taking on a more urgent tone, what happened at Valor House is happening right now at veteran facilities across California, Oregon, and Washington. I have here a list of properties scheduled for emergency inspections in the next month. She displayed a map showing dozens of marked locations. Each red dot represents a veteran's residence currently being targeted. The blue dots show properties already seized and redeveloped. Notice how they all follow the same pattern of sudden safety issues, bureaucratic complications, and aggressive buyout offers. Sarah Martinez stood, her decision made despite the career risks. Your Honor, given this evidence, the District Attorney's Office moves to immediately freeze all pending property transfers involving Golden Gate Development and its subsidiaries. Objection! City Attorney Davidson's voice cracked with desperation. This is beyond the scope of... Beyond the scope? Emily interrupted. Like the scope of your private consulting agreement with Golden Gate Development? She pulled out another document. This contract, showing you received $50,000 per month to provide strategic legal advice, while simultaneously representing the city in cases involving their properties. Davidson slumped in his chair as FBI agents approached him. The web of corruption was unraveling faster than anyone could have predicted, but Emily wasn't finished. She turned to her grandfather, receiving a slight nod of encouragement. Your Honor, what we've seen so far, the corrupt judges, the fake organizations, the manipulated inspections, it's all horrible, but it's also just the surface. She reached for her red folder, the one she'd kept sealed until now. This evidence shows where the money really went, not just to corrupt officials and shell companies, but to a network of politicians and power brokers who made it all possible. The same people who voted to cut veteran services while profiting from veteran displacement. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtroom as Emily prepared to reveal her most damaging evidence yet, the exposure of Judge Wells, had been just the beginning. The real earthquake was about to hit San Francisco's corridors of power, and nobody in that courtroom could predict how many more would fall before the day was done. The tension in courtroom 401 reached new heights as Emily opened her red folder. Even the FBI agents seemed to hold their breath, aware that whatever came next would extend far beyond San Francisco's city limits. News vans had begun clustering around the courthouse as word of Judge Wells' arrest spread across national media. "Your Honor," Emily began, her voice steady despite the pressure, "this evidence shows that the corruption we've uncovered isn't just about real estate or local officials. It reaches into the highest levels of state government and beyond." She removed a thick stack of documents, each page marked with yellow tabs. 3 years ago, the state legislature passed Bill SB 1274, which modified zoning regulations for properties housing veterans. The bill was presented as a measure to improve safety standards, but look at Section 47B. She displayed the relevant page on the courtroom screen. This single paragraph created a loophole allowing for expedited property seizures under the guise of safety violations. Assistant DA Martinez studied the text, her expression darkening. "This is specifically crafted to facilitate what Golden Gate Development was doing." "Exactly," Emily confirmed. "And here's why." She pulled out campaign finance records. In the 6 months before this bill passed, members of the State Housing Committee received over $3 million in campaign contributions from companies that, when traced through shell corporations, all lead back to Patriot Property Management. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Emily continued, displaying a series of emails on the screen. These communications between Thomas Wheeler and State Senator James Morrison show them literally drafting the language of Section 47B, the same section that would later be used to evict veterans across the state. In the gallery, James Richardson noticed several men in expensive suits quietly leaving the courtroom, phones pressed to their ears. Lieutenant Colonel Chen nudged him, pointing out others who were frantically typing on their phones. The power brokers were scrambling. "But the real smoking gun is this," Emily said, pulling out what appeared to be financial statements. Bank records showing transfers from Patriot Property Management's offshore accounts to a company called Legislative Solutions, LLC. This company, registered in Delaware, lists as its principal owner the wife of the State Housing Committee chairman. FBI agents were now speaking rapidly into their phones, clearly calling for additional resources. The case had just expanded dramatically, potentially involving state-level corruption and campaign finance violations. "Your Honor," Emily continued, "these documents show a clear pattern. Every time legislation affecting veteran housing came up for vote, large sums of money would flow through these shell companies to key decision-makers. The same pattern appears in Oregon and Washington state." She displayed a new diagram on the screen, showing a complex web of connections. This network wasn't just about buying properties. It was about changing laws to make veteran displacement easier and more profitable. They created a system where vulnerable veterans could be legally stripped of their homes while politicians profited from their suffering. Suddenly, Sarah Martinez's phone buzzed with an urgent message. Her face paled as she read it. "Emily," she said quietly, "the State Attorney General's office just announced an emergency press conference. They're trying to get ahead of this." "They can try," Emily replied, pulling out another document, "but they'll have trouble explaining this email from the Attorney General himself to Thomas Wheeler, discussing how to manage the political fallout." When veterans started protesting their evictions, in the back of the courtroom, Thomas Wheeler was having an intense, whispered conversation with his remaining lawyer. The attorney's repeated head-shaking suggested the news wasn't good. Emily continued methodically presenting her evidence. "This Spreadsheet shows political contributions mapped against veteran eviction dates. Notice the pattern. Every time a major eviction was planned, significant donations would flow to key politicians and officials through a network of PACs and shell companies. She displayed a series of photographs. These pictures show luxury, retreats where developers met with politicians to discuss veteran housing policy, meetings that were never disclosed as required by state law, meetings where the fate of thousands of veterans was decided over golf games and expensive dinners. Judge Bennett leaned forward, studying the evidence with growing concern. Miss Richardson, these allegations extend far beyond this court's jurisdiction. Yes, Your Honor. That's why I've already provided copies of all this evidence to federal authorities and state prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions. Emily's preparation had been thorough. What's happening to Valor House isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a systematic campaign to profit from veteran displacement. A campaign that required political protection to succeed. Suddenly, Lieutenant Colonel Chen's voice cut through the courtroom. "Look!" He pointed to the television screen mounted in the corner, normally used for evidence display. Someone had turned it to a news channel where breaking news banners announced, "State Housing Committee Chairman resigns amid corruption allegations." Emily nodded grimly. "That's just the beginning. In this folder, I have evidence linking 37 state legislators, 12 city councils, and numerous state officials to this scheme. Each one received payments through shell companies while voting on legislation that harmed veterans." The afternoon sun caught the edge of Emily's glasses as she reached for another document. But before she could continue, her grandfather noticed something alarming. Several men in dark suits had positioned themselves near the courtroom exits, their hands concealed in their jackets. "Emmy," he said quietly, his military training recognizing the threat, "we've got company." The FBI agents had noticed too, moving to intercept the suspicious men. The next few moments would determine not just the fate of Valor House, but potentially the entire political structure of California. And somewhere in the building, powerful people were making desperate decisions about how to stop a 12-year-old girl from exposing decades of corruption. The real battle was about to begin. The tension in courtroom 401 shifted from legal drama to immediate physical threat. The suspicious men near the exits had begun moving forward, but they hadn't counted on the veterans' response. Without a word being spoken, the former service members from Valor House repositioned themselves, forming a protective circle around Emily. Lieutenant Colonel Chen's voice carried the quiet authority of someone used to combat situations. "Sergeant Richardson, tactical assessment." James Richardson's eyes scanned the room, decades of military training kicking in. 6 hostiles, possibly armed. FBI assets in position. All exits covered. He turned to his granddaughter. "Emmy, remember what we discussed about contingencies?" Emily nodded calmly, pressing a button on her phone. Instantly, every document she'd been presenting appeared on journalists' phones and computers throughout the courtroom. The evidence was now beyond anyone's ability to suppress. "Your Honor," Emily addressed Judge Bennett, seemingly unruffled. "By the brewing confrontation, I believe some parties are about to attempt to interrupt these proceedings. Before they do, I'd like to enter one more piece of evidence into the record." She pulled out a final document from her red folder. "This is a recording and transcript from a meeting held last month at the governor's mansion. Present were Thomas Wheeler, State Senator Morrison, and several high-ranking members of the State Housing Authority. They were discussing what they called the final solution to the veteran problem. The FBI agents had moved to intercept the suspicious men, who suddenly found themselves facing both federal authorities and a wall of combat-hardened veterans. Assistant DA Martinez quickly signaled for additional courthouse security. Emily's voice remained steady as she played the recording. The familiar voice of Senator Morrison filled the courtroom. These properties are worth billions. If a few old soldiers have to find new accommodations, that's just progress. The governor assures me any resistance can be handled. The recording continued, revealing casual discussions about using building code violations, health inspections, and even manufactured criminal investigations to force veterans from their homes. The calculated cruelty of it sent waves of anger through the gallery. Suddenly, the courtroom doors burst open. But instead of more threats, a stream of additional FBI agents entered, accompanied by U.S. Marshals. Sarah Martinez's phone buzzed with breaking news. The FBI had just raided the offices of the State Housing Authority. As you can hear in this recording, Emily continued undeterred, the conspiracy extends beyond local officials. This wasn't just about profit. It was about systematically destroying veteran communities to make way for luxury developments. They specifically targeted facilities providing support for PTSD and substance abuse recovery, knowing these residents would have the hardest time fighting back. The suspicious men had begun retreating, realizing their intimidation tactics had failed, but the danger wasn't over. Thomas Wheeler was frantically whispering to his remaining lawyer, his face showing desperate calculation. Emily pulled out another document. This spreadsheet shows the full scope of their operation. Over the past 5 years, they've displaced more than 5,000 veterans from California alone. The human cost is staggering, but look at their profit calculations. She displayed a financial projection. They expected to make over $12 billion by converting these properties into luxury developments. Judge Bennett's face showed controlled fury as he reviewed the numbers. Miss Richardson, are you saying the state government was actively involved in this conspiracy? Yes, Your Honor, and not just involved, they were architects of it. Emily displayed a series of emails. These communications show the governor's office coordinating with Golden Gate Development to schedule inspections, plan evictions, and manage media coverage. They even discussed using state agencies to investigate veterans who tried to organize resistance. The television screens in the courtroom were now showing live coverage of FBI raids across the city. News helicopters captured footage of agents entering the offices of multiple development companies and political organizations. Lieutenant Colonel Chen spoke up from the gallery. Miss Richardson, 3 months ago, several of our residents were suddenly investigated by state agencies. Were these investigations part of their tactics? Yes, sir. Emily pulled out more documents. I have here emails showing how they targeted specific veterans who tried to speak out. They used state resources to investigate their finances, audit their benefits, even review their medical records, looking for ways to discredit them. The courtroom fell silent as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just about real estate. It was about powerful people systematically exploiting and silencing those who had served their country. James Richardson watched, his granddaughter, with a mixture of pride and concern. She was taking on not just corrupt developers, but the entire political establishment. The stakes had grown far beyond what anyone had imagined when this hearing began. Your Honor, Emily said, reaching for another folder, what I'm about to show you proves that this conspiracy reaches all the way to... Before she could finish, the power in the courthouse suddenly cut out. Emergency lights flickered on as Sarah Martinez's phone buzzed with an urgent alert. They're making their move, she whispered. The governor just declared a state of emergency, citing civil unrest as an excuse to clear the building. But Emily just smiled calmly. In the dim light, she held up her phone, showing dozens of download confirmations. They're too late. The evidence is already out there. Thousands of copies, all being downloaded by journalists and federal investigators across the country. The afternoon sun, filtering through the windows, provided enough light for everyone to see Thomas Wheeler. slump in his chair, realizing the game was over. The truth had escaped, and no amount of political power could contain it now. The real question was, how many more powerful figures would fall before this day was done? Emily's next revelation would shake the foundations of California's political establishment, and no emergency declaration could stop what was coming. In the emergency-lit courtroom, Emily Richardson remained composed as chaos erupted around her. The sudden power outage had triggered standard security protocols, but the veterans from Valor House maintained their protective formation around her, their military training evident in their calm coordination. "Your Honor," Emily addressed Judge Bennett, her voice clear in the semi-darkness, "I believe this interruption was deliberately orchestrated to prevent me from presenting evidence about the governor's direct involvement in this conspiracy. However, I anticipated such tactics." She removed a small solar-powered battery pack from her bag, connecting it to her laptop. The screen illuminated her face as she continued, "This document shows a direct money trail from Golden Gate Development through 7 shell companies, ultimately leading to the governor's family trust. Over $50 million in the past 2 years alone, all carefully disguised as legitimate business transactions." Assistant DA Sarah Martinez's phone screen provided additional light as she studied the financial records. These transactions coincide exactly with major policy decisions affecting veteran housing. Every time the governor signed legislation weakening tenant protections, his family trust received substantial payments. Through the courthouse windows, emergency vehicles' lights cast rotating patterns of red and blue across the walls. Outside, a growing crowd of journalists and supporters had gathered, their presence documented by hovering news helicopters. Furthermore, Emily continued, displaying documents on her laptop, "I have evidence that the governor's office actively coordinated with Golden Gate Development to schedule state inspections of veteran facilities. They specifically targeted buildings in high-value areas, using state agencies to manufacture violations." James Richardson spoke up from the gallery, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Like the surprise health inspection at Valor House last month, the one that came right after we refused their buyout offer?" "Exactly, Grandpa." Emily pulled up another document. "This email chain shows the governor's chief of staff coordinating with Thomas Wheeler to schedule that inspection. They even discussed which violations to find," quotes around the word "find" in their own email. Lieutenant Colonel Chen's military training had him positioned near a window, monitoring both the growing crowd outside and the suspicious movements within the courthouse. "Miss Richardson, we're picking up heavy police activity around the building. They're setting up barricades." Judge Bennett's voice cut through the tension. "Miss Richardson, given these extraordinary circumstances, I believe we should expedite the presentation of your remaining evidence." Emily nodded, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. "Your Honor, I'm currently uploading comprehensive documentation to secure servers. But there's something specific you need to see immediately." She turned her laptop toward the bench, displaying what appeared to be surveillance footage. "This video shows a meeting at the governor's private residence last month. Present were the governor, Thomas Wheeler, and representatives from 3 major development companies. They're discussing what they call Operation Clean Sweep, a coordinated plan to clear all remaining veteran housing facilities from prime real estate areas across California." The courtroom fell silent as the video played, showing California's highest elected official casually discussing the displacement of thousands of veterans. His words were particularly chilling. "If anyone makes noise about it, remind them that these people chose to serve. They can choose to find new housing." Suddenly, Sarah Martinez's phone buzzed with urgent news. "The governor's just announced an emergency press conference. He's claiming terrorist threats against state buildings. A convenient excuse to clear the courthouse, Emily observed calmly. But it won't work. She held up her phone, showing dozens of news notifications. The evidence is already trending nationwide. Veteran Justice and Just Governor Gate are the top Twitter hashtags in the country. The emergency lights flickered as heavy footsteps approached the courtroom. The veterans tensed, but instead of state, police, FBI tactical teams entered, led by senior federal agents. "Miss Richardson," one of the agents addressed her, "we've secured the building perimeter. The U.S. Attorney's Office is particularly interested in the evidence you've uncovered about interstate corruption." Emily reached for her final folder. "In that case, Agent, you'll want to see this. It's not just California. We've uncovered similar operations in 12 states, all connected through a network of shell companies and political contributions. The same developers, the same corrupt officials, the same pattern of veteran exploitation." As if on cue, the main power suddenly returned, screens flickering to life throughout the courtroom. Breaking news banners showed FBI raids happening simultaneously across multiple states. The conspiracy Emily had exposed was unraveling on a national scale. Thomas Wheeler, who had remained unusually quiet during the blackout, suddenly stood. "Your Honor, I need to speak with the U.S. Attorney's Office. I have information they might find valuable." "Starting to turn on your conspirators, Mr. Wheeler," Emily asked quietly. "You might want to hurry. According to my evidence, several of your colleagues are already negotiating deals." Judge Bennett's gavel cut through the tension. "This court will take a 30-minute recess to restore order. Miss Richardson, I trust you'll use this time to organize your remaining evidence?" Emily nodded, but her grandfather noticed her hands trembling slightly. For the first time that day, the strain of confronting such powerful forces was finally showing, though her voice remained steady. "Yes, Your Honor, though I should warn you, what comes next will make everything we've seen so far look like a minor scandal." As federal agents secured the courtroom and technical teams worked to prevent another power disruption, Emily prepared to reveal the final piece of her investigation, evidence that would expose corruption at the highest levels of National Veterans Affairs administration. The afternoon sun had begun its descent, but this day of revelations was far from over. The real earthquake in American politics was about to begin. When court resumed after the 30-minute recess, the atmosphere had transformed considerably. Additional FBI agents and federal prosecutors had arrived, filling the back of the courtroom. News networks had set up live broadcasts outside, their cameras capturing a steadily growing crowd of supporters, many of them veterans who had traveled from across the state after hearing about the case. Emily Richardson stood at the podium, her composure restored. The brief respite had allowed her to organize her most damaging evidence yet. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and clear, "what I'm about to present extends far beyond California. This evidence reveals a nationwide network of corruption targeting veterans' housing and services." She opened a new folder, marked with precise tabs and annotations. "Through our investigation of Golden Gate Development's activities, we discovered connections to similar operations in other states. These weren't independent schemes, they were part of a coordinated national strategy." Then, the courtroom display showed a complex organizational chart. This diagram maps the relationships between development companies, state officials, and federal contractors across the country. Notice how they all connect through a series of shell companies to an organization called National Veterans Asset Management. Assistant DA Martinez studied the diagram intently. "Miss Richardson, are you suggesting this was orchestrated at the federal level?" "Yes," Emily replied, pulling out another document. This internal memo from National Veterans Asset Management, dated January 2022, outlines what they called the national strategy. It details plans to systematically acquire veterans' facilities in high-value urban areas across all 50 states. She displayed financial records on the screen. The money trail is particularly revealing. Funds flow from development companies through multiple shell corporations, eventually reaching accounts controlled by senior officials in the Federal Veterans Affairs Administration. One of the FBI agents approached the bench, speaking quietly to Judge Bennett. After a brief conference, the judge addressed the courtroom. Given the scope of these allegations, I've been informed that the U.S. Attorney General's office is now directly involved in this investigation. Emily continued her presentation. This spreadsheet shows coordinated property acquisitions across 12 major cities. In each case, the pattern was identical: sudden regulatory issues, manufactured safety violations, and pressure on veterans to accept voluntary relocation. She displayed a series of photographs. These images show meetings between Thomas Wheeler and federal officials at private clubs and resorts. The dates correspond exactly with major policy changes affecting veterans' housing rights. Each decision made in these unofficial meetings impacted thousands of veterans' lives. James Richardson watched from the gallery as his granddaughter systematically exposed corruption that reached the highest levels of government. Around him, other veterans from Valor House sat in rigid attention, their faces showing a mixture of anger and vindication as the truth emerged. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence is this, Emily said, pulling out what appeared to be internal communications. Emails between federal officials discussing how to manipulate VA policies to facilitate these property seizures. They specifically targeted facilities providing mental health services and addiction treatment, knowing these vulnerable veterans would have the fewest resources to fight back. The courtroom screens displayed one particularly damning email. Focus on PTSD treatment centers first. These vets are easily discredited if they complain. Public sympathy won't last against claims of mental instability. Lieutenant Colonel Chen's voice cut through the silence that followed. That's why they started with the Portland facility. It specialized in PTSD treatment. Exactly, Emily confirmed. And here's the connection to our case. She displayed another document. Valor House was next on their list precisely because it offers mental health services. They saw our residents as easy targets. Sarah Martinez's phone buzzed with breaking news. The federal VA secretary has just announced his immediate resignation. No explanation given. He's trying to distance himself, Emily observed, but it's too late. She pulled out another folder. These records show his direct involvement in coordinating property seizures with development companies. His family trust received over $12 million through offshore accounts in the past 3 years. Thomas Wheeler, still present under FBI supervision, had grown increasingly agitated. Finally, he stood. Your Honor, I need to revise my earlier statements. I have information about federal involvement that the authorities might find relevant. Mr. Wheeler, Emily addressed him directly, are you referring to the meeting in Washington last month, the one where federal officials provided you with classified VA property assessments to help target vulnerable facilities? Wheeler's face paled. The 12-year-old girl had somehow uncovered meetings that were supposed to be completely untraceable. Judge Bennett leaned forward. Miss Richardson, exactly how far does this conspiracy extend? Emily's response was measured but firm. Your Honor, what we've uncovered here goes beyond simple corruption. This was a systematic attempt to profit from the vulnerability of those who served our country. The evidence I'm about to present will show that this conspiracy reaches into Congress, federal agencies, and even... She paused as Sarah Martinez passed her an urgent note. Her eyes widened slightly as she read it, then looked up at the judge. Your Honor, I believe we should prepare for another interruption. According to this, federal marshals are en route with sealed orders from Washington, attempting to shut down these proceedings. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows as Emily quickly organized her remaining evidence. The next few moments would determine whether the full truth would finally emerge, or whether forces in Washington would succeed in burying one of the largest corruption scandals in American history. The real battle for justice was about to begin. The tension in courtroom 401 intensified as footsteps echoed down the courthouse corridor. Emily Richardson remained composed at the podium, methodically organizing her evidence as federal marshals entered, carrying official documents bearing Department of Justice seals. "Your Honor," the lead marshal addressed Judge Bennett, "I have orders from the D.C. Circuit requiring an immediate stay of these proceedings on grounds of national security." He approached the bench with the sealed orders, his expression professionally neutral. Emily's voice cut through the mounting tension. "Your Honor, before you review those orders, I believe you should see this." She produced a document from her previously unopened black folder. This is a memo dated last week, originating from the Office of Legal Counsel in Washington. It outlines the exact strategy being employed right now, using national security claims to suppress evidence of corruption. Judge Bennett accepted both documents, studying them carefully. The federal marshals maintained their positions while FBI agents exchanged meaningful glances. The jurisdiction conflict was unprecedented. A local court case had somehow evolved into a constitutional crisis. "Furthermore," Emily continued, her voice steady, "I have here communications between senior Justice Department officials discussing how to contain what they called the San Francisco situation. These messages were sent hours after I first presented evidence about Judge Wells's corruption." Assistant DA Martinez stood, her decision made. "Your Honor, the District Attorney's Office challenges the validity of these stay orders. Under the precedent established in Pentagon Papers versus United States, national security claims cannot be used merely to conceal government misconduct." Emily nodded appreciatively at Martinez's support. "The timing of these orders is particularly revealing." She displayed a series of timestamps on the courtroom screen. "Notice how each attempt to suppress this case coincides exactly with evidence emerging about higher-level involvement." In the gallery, James Richardson watched with growing concern as more federal agents entered the courtroom. His military experience told him this was building toward a confrontation, but his granddaughter appeared completely prepared for this moment. "Your Honor," Emily addressed Judge Bennett, "I would like to direct the court's attention to Article 3 of the stay order." She highlighted specific text on the screen. "The language here is identical to formatting used in documents we've already proven were drafted by Golden Gate Development's legal team. They're not even trying to hide their involvement anymore." The lead federal marshal shifted uncomfortably. Emily's precise legal knowledge and preparation had clearly caught them off guard. No one had expected a 12-year-old to challenge federal authority with such expertise. "Moreover," Emily continued, "I have evidence that the officials who requested these stay orders have direct financial connections to the corruption we've been exposing." She produced another document. Bank records showing transfers from shell companies we've identified to accounts controlled by family members of senior Justice Department officials. Lieutenant Colonel Chen spoke up from the gallery, his military authority evident. "Miss Richardson, are you suggesting that federal officials are actively participating in the cover-up?" "Not suggesting, sir. Proving." Emily displayed more financial records. These transactions show a clear pattern. Every time evidence of corruption surfaces in a veterans' housing case, certain accounts in the Cayman Islands receive substantial deposits. The beneficiaries of these accounts include family members of officials now trying to shut down our investigation. Judge Bennett studied the stay orders with growing skepticism. Miss Richardson, your evidence suggests a coordinated effort to obstruct justice at the federal level. Do you have documentation of who authorized these orders? Yes, Your Honor. Emily's response was immediate, and that documentation reveals something extraordinary. She opened her final folder, removing a single sheet of paper. This authorization came directly from the office of the White House counsel. But look, at the routing information. It was drafted on computers belonging to National Veterans Asset Management. The same organization we've shown is central to the corruption. The federal marshals exchanged concerned looks. This was far beyond what they had expected to encounter. One of them stepped away, speaking urgently into his phone. Sarah Martinez's phone buzzed with breaking news. The Attorney General has just announced an emergency press conference. They're trying to get ahead of this. Too late, Emily said, calmly holding up her phone. Every document I've presented is already being published by major news organizations across the country. Courts in 12 states are receiving similar evidence right now. They can't suppress this anymore. Judge Bennett's decision was clear. The stay orders are denied. This court will not be party to an attempted cover-up of corruption against our veterans. Miss Richardson, please continue with your evidence. Emily nodded, reaching for another folder. Thank you, Your Honor. What I'm about to present will demonstrate that this conspiracy reaches directly into... She paused as her grandfather signaled her quietly. More vehicles were arriving outside the courthouse. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows as Emily prepared to reveal her most damaging evidence yet. The next few moments would determine whether justice would prevail or whether powerful forces in Washington would succeed in burying the truth. The real test of America's commitment to justice was about to begin. With the federal stay orders denied, the atmosphere in courtroom 401 transformed from tense confrontation to focused anticipation. The federal marshals had retreated to the back of the courtroom, conferring urgently with their superiors in Washington. Emily Richardson stood at the podium, her evidence organized before her, ready to reveal the full scope of corruption at the highest levels of government. Your Honor, Emily began, her voice carrying the weight of what was to come. What I'm about to present demonstrates that the exploitation of veterans wasn't just the work of corrupt local officials or ambitious developers. It was orchestrated from the highest offices in Washington, involving cabinet members, congressional leaders, and federal agencies. She removed a thick document from her final folder. This report, prepared by the Congressional Budget Office, but never released, details how the systematic displacement of veterans from their homes was directly tied to federal infrastructure spending. Every time Congress approved major urban development grants, specific veteran housing facilities were targeted for acquisition. Assistant DA Martinez studied the document with growing concern. Miss Richardson, are you suggesting that federal infrastructure funds were being used to facilitate these displacements? Not just facilitate, they were designed for it. Emily displayed a series of congressional communications on the courtroom screen. These emails between senior members of the House Appropriations Committee show them coordinating with developers to ensure infrastructure projects would trigger emergency relocations of veteran facilities. In the gallery, James Richardson noticed several journalists quietly leaving the courtroom, phones pressed to their ears. The story was spreading faster than anyone could control it. Lieutenant Colonel Chen's military training had him monitoring the increasing activity outside the courthouse, where news vans were arriving by the dozen. But the real corruption goes even deeper, Emily continued, producing another set of documents. This evidence shows that the Federal Veterans Affairs Administration was actively collaborating with private developers to identify vulnerable facilities. They provided confidential information about veterans' medical conditions, financial status, and support networks, all to help determine which communities would be easiest to displace. She displayed internal emails that made the courtroom collectively gasp. High-ranking federal officials casually discussed using veterans' PTSD diagnoses and addiction struggles as leverage to discredit any who might resist eviction. Target the ones with mental health issues first, one email read. No one believes crazy vets anyway. Judge Bennett's face hardened as he reviewed the evidence. Miss Richardson, these allegations implicate sitting members of Congress and Cabinet. Officials, do you have concrete proof of their direct involvement? Yes, Your Honor. Emily's response was immediate. She produced banking records and financial statements. These documents show how federal officials used their family members and associates to receive payments through a complex network of shell companies. Every major decision affecting veterans' housing can be tied to specific deposits in offshore accounts. Sarah Martinez's phone buzzed continuously with breaking news alerts. The Speaker of the House has just cancelled all scheduled votes. Multiple congressional offices are reportedly being raided by federal agents. Emily nodded, unsurprised. That would be in response to this evidence. She displayed another document, a complete record of every payment made to congressional family members through companies connected to National Veterans Asset Management, over $300 million in the past 5 years alone. The federal marshals had stopped attempting to intervene, their phones buzzing constantly with new developments. The story had grown beyond anyone's ability to contain it. Your Honor, Emily continued, her voice steady despite the mounting tension. What makes this conspiracy particularly egregious is how it exploited the very systems designed to protect veterans. She produced a series of internal memos from the Veterans Affairs Administration. These documents show how officials deliberately underfunded mental health services and housing assistance programs, creating artificial crises that developers could exploit. Lieutenant Colonel Chen spoke from the gallery, his voice tight with controlled anger. They were setting us up to fail, making sure we'd have nowhere else to go when they took our homes. Exactly, sir. Emily displayed more evidence on the screen. And it wasn't just housing. They systematically dismantled support services, redirected funding, and created paperwork nightmares that would discourage veterans from seeking help, all while private developers and corrupt officials profited from their suffering. Judge Bennett leaned forward. Miss Richardson, given the scope of these allegations, what do you suggest as the appropriate response from this court? Emily's answer was measured but firm. Your Honor, this court has the authority to issue injunctions preventing any further displacement of veterans from their homes. But more importantly, it has the power to ensure that all evidence of this corruption becomes part of the public record, beyond the reach of those who would try to bury it. Suddenly, Sarah Martinez received an urgent message. Emily, the President has just announced an emergency address to the nation tonight. They're trying to get ahead of this. They can try, Emily replied calmly, reaching for her final piece of evidence. But they should see this first. She held up a document that made even the federal marshals step forward in interest. This proves that the corruption doesn't just reach into Congress or federal agencies. It goes all the way to... The afternoon sun had begun its final descent, casting long shadows across the courtroom as Emily prepared to reveal the ultimate extent of the conspiracy. The next few moments would change not just the fate of America's veterans, but the very nature of power in Washington itself. The final battle for justice was about to begin. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. As Emily Richardson held up her final piece of evidence, even the federal marshals had stopped their communications with Washington, sensing the gravity of the moment. The document in her hands, bound in a simple black folder, represented the culmination of months of careful investigation. "Your Honor," Emily began, her voice clear and steady, "this evidence demonstrates that the systematic exploitation of veterans was directly orchestrated by the executive branch itself. What I'm about to present proves that the office of the President was not just aware of this corruption, it was actively coordinating it." She placed a series of documents on the evidence display. "These communications, obtained through multiple sources, show regular meetings between senior White House officials and the principals of National Veterans Asset Management. The President's Chief of Staff personally approved the strategy for what they called the National Realignment of Veteran Resources." Assistant DA Martinez studied the documents with growing disbelief. "Miss Richardson, these meetings weren't disclosed in any official schedules or visitor logs." "No, Ms. Martinez, they weren't." Emily displayed another document. "Because they were conducted through a private corporation called Presidential Policy Advisors LLC, a company that, when traced through shell corporations, leads directly back to the President's family trust." Judge Bennett leaned forward, his expression grave. "Miss Richardson, these are extraordinary allegations. What evidence do you have of direct White House involvement?" Emily produced a series of financial records. These transactions show regular payments from National Veterans Asset Management to Presidential Policy Advisors, LLC, coinciding exactly with major policy decisions affecting veterans' housing. Each time the White House issued an executive order or policy directive impacting veteran facilities, corresponding payments were made to offshore accounts. In the gallery, James Richardson watched his granddaughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Around him, other veterans from Valor House sat in rigid attention, their faces showing controlled anger as the full scope of betrayal became clear. "But the most damning evidence is this," Emily continued, displaying what appeared to be private email correspondence. Direct communications between White House senior advisors discussing how to, and I quote, "manage the veteran problem without creating political liability." They specifically targeted facilities in key electoral districts, timing displacements, to minimize political impact. Sarah Martinez's phone buzzed continuously with breaking news alerts. "The White House has just cancelled the President's emergency address. They're in full crisis mode." Emily nodded, unsurprised. "Because of this," she displayed another document. A complete record of every meeting between White House officials and developers, including detailed notes about which veteran communities to target first. They prioritized facilities based on the estimated real estate value of the properties, completely disregarding the human cost. Lieutenant Colonel Chen spoke from the gallery, his voice carrying decades of military authority. "They were treating us like chess pieces, moving us around to maximize their profits." "Exactly, sir." Emily produced more evidence. These White House strategy memos show how they plan to use VA policies to create artificial crises, forcing veterans out of valuable urban properties. They even discussed using military deployment schedules to time their property acquisitions, targeting facilities while service members were overseas and unable to protect their communities. The federal marshals had completely abandoned their attempts to intervene, now watching in stunned silence as Emily systematically exposed corruption at the highest level of government. One of them was openly taking photographs of the evidence with his phone. "Your Honor," Emily continued, "this final document proves the direct involvement of—" She paused as Judge Bennett received an urgent message. His face showed momentary surprise before settling into firm resolve. "Miss Richardson," he said, "I've just been informed that the White House is invoking executive privilege on all communications related to veteran housing policies." Emily's response was immediate. "They can't, Your Honor. Under the precedent established in United States v. Nixon, Executive privilege cannot be used to conceal evidence of criminal activity. Furthermore, she produced another document. This executive order, signed last year, specifically waived privilege for all communications related to veteran services. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtroom as Emily prepared to reveal her final piece of evidence. The document in her hands would prove that the president himself had personally profited from the displacement of veterans, using his office to enrich himself at the expense of those who had served their country. Sarah Martinez stood. Your Honor, given the scope of these revelations, the District Attorney's Office moves to immediately transmit all evidence to the appropriate federal authorities and congressional oversight committees. Judge Bennett nodded gravely. Motion? Granted. Miss Richardson, please proceed with your final evidence. Emily took a deep breath, aware that what she was about to reveal would shake the foundations of American democracy itself. The ultimate truth about who had orchestrated the systematic betrayal of America's veterans was about to be exposed, and no amount of executive privilege could stop it. The final moment of reckoning had arrived. As Emily Richardson prepared to present her final evidence, the atmosphere in courtroom 401 had transformed from legal proceeding to historic moment. News networks had managed to get cameras into the courtroom, broadcasting live across the nation. The American public was about to witness one of the most significant revelations in political history. Your Honor, Emily began, her voice steady. Despite the weight of the moment, this final document proves that President Andrew Mitchell personally profited from the systematic displacement of veterans through a complex network of shell companies and foreign trusts. She produced a thick file, its pages carefully annotated and cross-referenced. These financial records show transfers from National Veterans Asset Management through 17 different shell companies, ultimately reaching accounts controlled by the Mitchell Family Trust in the Cayman Islands. Over the past 4 years, these accounts received more than $3 billion from properties seized from veteran communities. Assistant DA Martinez studied the documents with growing disbelief. Miss Richardson, these transactions coincide exactly with major policy decisions affecting veteran housing programs. Yes, Emily confirmed, displaying more evidence on the courtroom screen. Every time the president signed an executive order weakening veteran protections or redirecting VA resources, corresponding payments were made to these offshore accounts. The timing is precise and documented. In the gallery, James Richardson watched as his granddaughter systematically exposed corruption at the highest level of American government. Around him, veterans from Valor House sat in rigid attention, their faces showing a mixture of vindication and controlled anger. Furthermore, Emily continued, this email chain shows direct communications between President Mitchell and Thomas Wheeler discussing specific veteran communities to target. She highlighted key passages on the screen. The president personally selected which facilities would be seized first, based on the estimated real estate values and potential profit margins. Sarah Martinez's phone buzzed with urgent news. Congressional leadership has just called for an emergency session. They're discussing impeachment proceedings. Emily nodded, unsurprised. Because of this evidence. She displayed another document, a complete record of every meeting between President Mitchell and developers, including detailed notes about their strategy to dismantle veteran support systems. They specifically targeted facilities providing mental health services and addiction treatment, knowing these veterans would be least able to resist. Lieutenant Colonel Chen spoke from the gallery, his voice carrying decades of military authority. They deliberately attacked the most vulnerable among us. Exactly, sir. Emily produced more records. These White House strategy memos show how they plan to use VA policies to create artificial crises. They intentionally underfunded critical services, making it impossible for facilities to meet new safety standards that were designed specifically to justify seizures. Judge Bennett's face showed controlled fury as he reviewed the evidence. "Miss Richardson, what you're presenting goes beyond corruption. This appears to be a systematic conspiracy against American veterans, orchestrated from the Oval Office itself." "Yes, Your Honor." Emily's response was firm. "And this final piece of evidence proves it beyond any doubt." She held up what appeared to be a recorded conversation. "This is a meeting between President Mitchell and his financial advisors, recorded in the Oval Office last month." The courtroom fell silent as the president's voice filled the room. These veterans had their chance to make something of themselves. If they can't afford to live in prime real estate areas, that's their problem. We're just helping the market correct itself. Sarah Martinez stood. "Your Honor, given these revelations, the district attorney's office moves to immediately refer all evidence to the Department of Justice and Congressional Oversight Committees." "Motion granted," Judge Bennett replied. "Miss Richardson, please ensure all evidence is properly preserved and transmitted to federal authorities." Suddenly, breaking news alerts began flooding every phone in the courtroom. The president had announced his immediate resignation, citing health concerns. His entire senior staff had also resigned, and federal agents were seen entering the White House. Emily wasn't finished. "Your Honor, while the president's resignation is significant, it doesn't address the broader conspiracy. I have here evidence showing that this system of corruption extends into multiple federal agencies, congressional offices, and state governments across the country." She displayed a final series of documents showing how the veteran exploitation scheme had been replicated nationwide, with similar patterns of corruption and displacement in every major city. The web of corruption she had uncovered would take years to fully unravel. Judge Bennett's voice cut through the mounting tension. "Miss Richardson started this hearing to save one veteran's facility. You've ended up exposing what may be the largest corruption scandal in American history." Emily's response was simple but powerful. "Your Honor, I started this fight to save my grandfather's home, but along the way I discovered that every veteran in this country deserved the same protection. They fought for us. It was time someone fought for them." As the afternoon sun cast its final rays through the courthouse windows, Emily Richardson, the 12-year-old girl who had brought down a president and exposed systemic corruption, gathered her evidence folders. The story of how she had changed American history would be told for generations to come, but for now there was still work to be done. The fight to protect America's veterans was just beginning. 1 month after the historic courtroom revelations, Emily Richardson stood on the steps of Valor House, watching as veterans and their families celebrated the facility's official protection under new federal legislation. The Veterans Housing Protection Act rushed through Congress in response to the scandal, now safeguarded veteran housing facilities nationwide from predatory development schemes. Inside the newly renovated community room, James Richardson sat with Lieutenant Colonel Chen and other Valor House residents, watching President pro tempore Alice Howard sign additional executive orders on television. The orders, part of a comprehensive reform package, restored and expanded veteran services across the country. "Miss Richardson," a reporter called out, "how does it feel to have changed American history at 12 years old?" Emily's response was characteristically measured. This wasn't about making history. It was about protecting people who had already made history through their service. Every veteran deserves a home and the support they were promised. Assistant DA Sarah Martinez, recently appointed to lead the new Federal Veterans Protection Bureau, approached with fresh documents. "Emily, you'll want to see this. The Congressional Oversight Committee just released their first report. Your Evidence has led to 317 indictments so far, including 42 members of Congress and dozens of state officials. 9. The scope of change triggered by Emily's courtroom revelations had exceeded anyone's expectations. Thomas Wheeler and his co-conspirators had all pleaded guilty, providing evidence against higher-level officials in exchange for leniency. Judge Wells was serving a 20-year sentence for judicial corruption, and former President Mitchell faced multiple federal charges. "Emmy!" her grandfather called from inside. "Come see this." The television showed federal agents raiding offices across the country, executing warrants based on Emily's evidence. The corruption network she had exposed continued to unravel, revealing new connections and conspiracies daily. Lieutenant Colonel Chen, now heading a veteran advocacy committee working with Congress, shared updates about nationwide reforms. Every veteran housing facility that was illegally seized is being restored. The government's establishing a special compensation fund for displaced veterans, funded by seized assets from the corrupt developers. Emily watched as moving trucks arrived at Valor House, bringing back residents who'd been forced out by the previous schemes. Each return represented a small victory in the larger battle for veterans' rights. The facility was not just surviving. Now, it was expanding, with new mental health services and support programs being added. "Your testimony changed everything," Sarah Martinez observed, showing Emily more documents. "Look at these numbers. Veteran homelessness has dropped 30% just in the past month. Every city is reviewing its housing policies, and developers can't get near veteran facilities without extreme scrutiny." The afternoon sun highlighted the new sign being installed at Valor House's entrance, "Protected under the Richardson Act," the popular name for the comprehensive reform legislation inspired by Emily's fight. The act established unprecedented protections for veteran housing and services, ensuring that what happened at Valor House could never happen again. Judge Bennett, who had presided over the historic case, arrived for the celebration. "Miss Richardson," he addressed Emily with genuine respect, "your courage didn't just save one facility. You've created a legacy that will protect veterans for generations to come." Inside the community room, a wall displayed photographs documenting the case that had changed America. Emily's quiet determination in the courtroom, the veterans who had supported her the moment when presidential corruption was exposed, all preserved as testament to what one person with truth on their side could accomplish. "The most important change," James Richardson noted proudly, "is that veterans know they're not alone anymore. Anyone who tries to take advantage of them will face serious consequences." The other veterans nodded in agreement, their faces showing the relief of men and women who finally felt secure in their homes. Emily's methodical preparation had become a model for legal education programs nationwide. Law schools were studying her techniques, and veteran advocacy groups had adopted her systematic approach to documenting and exposing corruption. Her case had set precedents that would influence American jurisprudence for decades. As evening approached, Emily sat with her grandfather on Valor House's porch, watching residents return to their homes. "You know, Emmy," he said softly, "when you first said you were going to fight this in court, I was terrified. I thought you were too young, too inexperienced. I've never been happier to be wrong." Emily smiled, remembering the journey that had led to this moment. "They thought no one would listen to a 12-year-old girl. That's why they never saw me coming. They were so focused on intimidating adults that they didn't notice a kid doing their homework." The sunset cast warm colors across Valor House's restored facade as veterans and their families gathered for an impromptu celebration. The facility that had almost been lost to corruption had become a symbol of hope and justice, a reminder that Courage comes in all ages and sizes. Reporter notebooks captured Emily's final words of the day. This started as a fight to save one home. It became a movement to protect all homes. But most importantly, it proved that when we stand up for what's right, even the most powerful corruption can't stand against the truth. As night fell over San Francisco, lights burned bright at Valor House. No longer a target for corrupt developers, but a beacon of hope for veterans nationwide. Emily Richardson had not just won a court case. She had changed the very fabric of American justice, ensuring that those who served their country would always have a place to call home. The legacy of a 12-year-old girl's courage would protect veterans for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.